Quote, "The life of a man is so short that ordinary people simply cannot afford to be born." End quote. This is a quote from the famous Icelandic novel Independent People by Halldór Laxness. He was the only Nobel Prize-winning author from Iceland, so he has a towering figure when it comes to Icelandic literature. And Independent People is his most well-known novel. You cannot talk about Icelandic literature without mentioning the Icelandic sagas as building blocks of its literature. Saga incidentally means saying or speech, but in this context means stories. Legends, myths, and epics are produced in every human culture, but what is unique about Icelandic sagas is that they are written down in prose and about real people. The Icelandic sagas were written from 600 to 800 years ago. They are some of the most well-known examples of written literature in the world. Inspired by Norse legends, the Icelandic sagas are basically long stories about heroes or several generations of a family that settled on Iceland, with their roots in Norway and other parts of Scandinavia. Okay, let me tell you about the author. Halldór Laxness was born in 1902 and died in 1998, living almost the entirety of the 20th century. He was the first and last Icelandic to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1955. For a country of 300,000 people, it's an amazing achievement. He was influenced by Sweden's August Strindberg and Norway's Knut Hamsun, which I will discuss in separate videos on Norway and Sweden. For a period, he became Catholic and belonged to a group that wanted to revert Nordic countries from Lutheranism to Catholicism. But later, he turned socialist and got very close to the Soviet Union. But his love affair with the Soviets somewhat ended with the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution. I think at heart, Laxness was an individualist with a deep care for the weak and vulnerable. He was a nomad like most writers of the 20th century, moved between ideologies as they traveled between countries and ideas. Nietzsche had a profound influence on a lot of writers of this period. In Laxness, individual freedom, not in a selfish libertarian sense, but a more inner freedom, freedom of consciousness, is very important. Independent People was published in 2 volumes in 1934 and 1935. When I first heard of the title, I thought it was a political novel, but it deals mainly with one man and his family. The Icelandic title, Sjálfstætt folk, means self-standing or self-reliant folk, basically being your own boss. The protagonist, Bjartur, wants to have his own farm, and his dream is to owe nothing to anyone. He's the kind of man who would be burning credit cards because he doesn't want to have debt. Interestingly, in 2008, after the financial crisis, Iceland, unlike other countries, didn't bail out its banks and let them collapse. I can see Bjartur enjoying that moment as very cathartic. Okay, what is it about? The main character, Bjartur, which incidentally means bright in Icelandic, has worked for 18 years as a shepherd for someone else, whom he hates. This experience has made him love sheep more than people, but his shepherd's days are in the past. He has bought a farm and a house called Winter House, which he renames as Summer House. His goal is to pay the mortgage or debt and be free at last. But there's something wrong with the farm. The land is cursed by a witch who used to kill men for their blood and marrow. After her death, her ghost continues to do the same thing, hunting and killing men. Bjartur is a rational and sensible man who doesn't believe in ghosts and evil spirits like everyone else. But his wife, Rosa, is scared. According to my internet research, many Icelandic people still believe in elves, trolls, ghosts, and such. Perhaps that's the reason that 60% of Iceland's population lives in Reykjavik, so trolls, elves, and ghosts can roam freely in the rest of the country, and tourists and photographers as well, of course. One night when Rosa is pregnant, incidentally with someone else's child, craves for some meat. She is sick of eating fish every day. In the novel, fish is plenty and readily available. This surprised me, so I thought on a farm, meat would be the staple diet. Farm animals are like expensive car, while fish is everywhere, so she secretly kills one of the sheep. Bjartur, thinking the sheep has escaped, leaves his heavily pregnant wife alone and embarks on a search in stormy weather that almost kills him. But by the time he returns home, he finds Rosa dead at childbirth, and the dog has saved the baby by keeping it warm. He names her Asta, and she survives. I think the novel should have ended here. The rest of the novel deals with his second wife and 3 children, and ultimately Bjartur losing everyone and the farm for which he fought tooth and nail. Finally, he moves into an abandoned house that belongs to his mother-in-law and invites his strange daughter Asta, who has her own child by then. There is a hint in the novel that Asta might be the ghost that terrorized men and the legends. So at the end, the dream of being independent didn't materialize for Bjartur, but he did reconcile with his daughter. Now let me talk about some of the themes of this novel. Freedom or independence is a very important theme in the novel. Beator is a difficult character. On the one hand, he desires to be independent, which makes him a likable character. Freedom appears so fundamental as a principle for him that sometimes you question his extremist idea of being free and disentangled from others at any cost. In fact, he's so proud of his independence that he refuses any offer of help. His idealistic principle makes him suspect everyone's intentions nothing but cunning and deceitful, which is sad. I can understand his pain at being a shepherd for a despicable man, but at times he talks about his independence as if it's the only thing that matters in life, nothing else. Not his wife, not his children, nobody else. This makes him a really tragic figure, stubborn to the point that he no longer feels any empathy towards others whom he thinks are encroaching on his freedom. The tragedy of his wife's death and the final tragedy is the loss of the farm. Asta, his daughter, while pregnant, is kicked out of the house. Despite his harsh life, the man lives in his head most of the time anyway. He writes poetry to keep himself alive at one point. The idea of individual freedom we take for granted today was a new concept about 100 years ago for ordinary people and still is in most of the world. If anything, the harsh environment of Iceland doesn't bring people together but keeps them apart as they pride their space and freedom. Here is a quote that sums up this idea. Quote, "Two human beings have such difficulty in understanding each other. There is nothing so sad as two human beings. So it's best to live a life that has minimal dealings with other people." The second thing I noticed was its icy cold realism. When he finds his wife dead, he's indifferent. No emotion. In fact, not a single person shows any emotion at her death. Nobody cries, screams, or even sobs. Also, the news of her death is taken as no surprise by anyone, as if a goat died. Beator thinks about his missing sheep more than his dead wife. Here's a quote, "I see no reason why, just because a couple of womenfolk have kicked the bucket, people should start writing religion about them." End quote. Religion is very prominent in the novel, which made me wonder how a religion originating in the desert of Middle East found its way in the coldest place on earth. Anyway, what fascinated me more was how cold weather influenced characters. Individualism, isolation are counterbalanced by the parish as a practical support community. In fact, the first pension scheme was developed by two priests in Scotland, the Scottish Widow, now the largest pension insurance company. The Nordic countries are also known for having the best welfare system, so cold weather does bring people together on a more practical level rather than tears or screams. People are more pragmatic than emotional. One thing that this novel busts is the myth and the romanticism of living in the country. It's bloody hard work. One thing I found interesting was how much coffee people drink. Here's a quote, "Presently the smell of coffee began to fill the room. This was morning's hallowed moment. In such a fragrance the perversity of the world is forgotten and the soul is inspired with faith in the future." End quote. I have the same feeling about my morning coffee, full of optimism, but only to realize in the evening that I managed nothing worthwhile. Well, most days anyway. Nature is at the heart of this novel. Here's a quote, "Fina didn't bear a child that winter. Her body wasn't ready for some reason." End quote. Life is so simplified to its basic natural state. For example, that winter everyone survived. End quote. They counted their children and animals in the autumn and then in the spring to know who has survived. Winter is a real ordeal in northern countries, which make animals very significant in this novel. Beator loves his sheep. Sheep has an almost divine role for him, which shows that he hasn't forgotten his 18 years as a shepherd. He respects dogs for their intelligence. The novel spends more time talking about the arrival of a cow in the family than the arrival of a new wife and kids, which shows that when it comes to the basics of nature, we give importance to things that help us survive. Animals symbolize survival, security, comfort, and everything in between, while people means more mouths to feed. It's a novel of change and transition. The novel starts with Beator buying a farm which he renamed Summer House. There is optimism in the air that Iceland is changing. Beator's house is located on the road, so travelers, farmers, and holidaymakers pass the house all the time. It's a period of transition for people as well as the country. At one point, Beator takes his daughter Asta to town. Seeing all the tall buildings and so many people, she feels so insignificant and small. She notices everything and everyone. Town people, on the other hand, have developed a skill not to see others, treat them like trees and plants. But ultimately, despite Beator's best effort to change his life, he failed to establish his own independent farm. In a way, this is the harsh reality of life of one man. No matter how hard you work, sometimes you cannot change your life in a way you had dreamt. Writing. The writing is very lyrical about dreams shattered by the rain, the sound of thunder, and ghosts in the mountains, and the restless sheep giving birth. It's full of amazing sentences. For example, quote, "A land even more remote, America, which is farther than death," end quote. This sentence alone tells us so much about the people, isolated country of Iceland, and how America symbolizes a land of dreams, but only dreams. The poetry cited in the novel are also very beautiful and capture the raw nature of Iceland and its harsh yet beautiful landscape. The narrative is not very smooth. As I said before, I think the novel should have focused more on the couple and how their conflict symbolized the conflict with others and nature. After Rosa's death, the novel loses the narrative drive a bit. The early energy somewhat dissipates. Bjartor as a character is pretty frustrating at times. He's the kind of person who goes in the middle of winter in search of a lost ship and ends up fighting with a moose. An epic ride on the river. He recites poetry to keep his spirit up. Funny as it is, he seems a bit delusional. When he finds his wife dead and a little child hanging for dear life under the body of a dog, he doesn't know what to do. When he goes to the village for help, it takes him hours to tell the actual news of the death after reciting some poetry and his tale of adventure in the mountains. Overall, it's a very profound novel. It's one of those novels which the author didn't flinch in telling the story as its rawest. A profound novel of ice-cold realism. That's what you expect from Iceland. Despite its name, Iceland is very green. Some people say Greenland and Iceland should swap their names because Greenland is mostly ice while Iceland is mostly green. This just shows how random humans are at naming things. I would love to hear what you think. Thank you for watching.